Uh, oh. Hi all. Welcome to Reformation Restoration Week. Sorry for the tank top, but it is insanely hot out right now, and I'm literally gonna die in this room unless I'm wearing this, so just shield your eyes. This period was a really tricky one for me because going into this class and going into this program, I think it's the one that I cursorily knew least about. There was kind of a blank in between Shakespeare and Victoria. Well, I guess that's not quite true. I knew that there were some Georges in the middle there who couldn't keep hold of the United States, and that's all I had. So it presented a unique challenge to me because I didn't know where to start because I didn't quite know what it covered. So what I did, which is what I think a lot of people do when they're lost, is I went to the Museum of London, which covers every period of British history, to try to figure out what was there and what I could learn from. And there I was kind of turned on to the saga of Oliver Cromwell's glorious revolution and what it did to British politics and how tangibly it affected the way that they still operate as a country with a parliamentary system now. So I went from knowing absolutely nothing about this period at the beginning of it to being completely obsessed with this guy and what he did, and I ended up chasing him and his story all over London to try to get evidence of or not even evidence, to try to put the pieces of his story together in my head. And even a couple of weeks later, I can't get it away from it, I was in Ely with a friend from the program, which is kind of north of Cambridge, out in the middle of nowhere in some fields, and it turns out that his house was there. And I got stupidly excited about this guy's house, and it made me realize that I am actually gaining something from this research, and that discovery and exploration for the sake of history is actually something that I'm really interested in. So, with that self-reflective nonsense out of the way, let's figure out where Oliver Cromwell came from, where he was going to, and how it affected the Reformation and Restoration era. I started my adventures this week at the Museum of London to gain a little bit of context for what I was doing, and I found some really information first off about the Black Plague, which happened during this era. Honestly, people during this period had a really, really rough time. A bunch of greatly awful stuff happened. Basically two revolutions, a great fire, a plague, a lot of people died, so really I think that it's kind of impressive that they got through all of it. I then found Oliver Cromwell's death mask. Now, this is an actual plastering and then metal cast of his dead head after he croaked, and he caught my interest. I knew that he was an important figure in their history, but I wasn't sure why, and so I followed him to the only natural place, Westminster Palace, or as people know it better now, the Houses of Parliament. This building is bigger and more exciting than you could ever imagine. I can't even begin to describe it, and oh my gosh, the first time you see Big Ben, you know you're in London and you just about die. This building is a lot more than a pretty landmark, though. It is where the beheading of Charles I led into the rule of Oliver Cromwell, led into the death of Oliver Cromwell, led into the rule of Charles II, the son of Charles I. It's really quite a big deal. Parliament isn't in session right now because a general election is coming up on June 8th, and so I got to take a tour that went deep into the heart of the building in places you normally wouldn't get to see. Unfortunately, you can't take pictures in a lot of those places, but I will try to describe to you what I found. I was really excited to stand in this building where Charles I made a huge stink about basically divine right and was beheaded for it. Not at this building, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Particular highlights included the gorgeous stained glass windows and a new art sculpture that's talking about women's work in politics that alters with the tides of the Thames. How cool! Some of my other favorites were plaques indicating the actual spots where people stood as they were being tried, such as Charles I, and actually where Winston Churchill laid until he was buried on the 13th of January in 1965. Another questionable character. We can talk about him later. Also, the bathrooms were really pretty. Fun fact. And independent of Reformation stuff, going into Parliament was really cool. They're in a time right now of political strife that I would say is not quite as cataclysmic as the one happening in the United States, but it's there, and a lot of people aren't sure of what to do, what'll happen, and something occurred in their political system that they really didn't think was going to, kind of like with us. And so walking through at a time when Parliament wasn't in session, it was solemn, it was quiet, and it felt like people biding their time and waiting for the future to happen, which was something I'm really grateful I got to witness, but it reminded me a lot of what's happening back at home. On the plus side, I got to sit in the no lobby, which is where people in the House of Commons stand when they need to vote no on something, and got to stand about 3 feet away from where Theresa May sits whenever she's in Parliament. So, history in action, folks. I had a pretty great time before I moved right on down the street, Whitehall, where a bunch of Reformation Restoration history happened, plus a bunch of current political history. So, take a look. I took a little trip up the road, passing by 10 Downing Street and this gorgeous World War II memorial representing the women who died during the war, up to what is now known as the Banqueting House. Now, this is where Charles I was actually killed, but it was initially part of a palace that was burned down in a fire. Surprise, surprise. You start off the tour in James I's secret drinking room, and then go upstairs to the most breathtaking, gobsmacking ceiling, and my heart is broken because I tried to take pictures and just nothing can quite articulate how beautiful this ceiling is. Unfortunately, it's very, very propaganda filled. It's all about James I liberating the country and trying to reinforce the idea of divine rule, but how horrible would it be as Charles I, someone who believes in the divine right to rule, being led through this hallway on his way to a windowsill on which he was decapitated for the whole world to see. That must have been a moment of some pretty dark reflection. I kept moving along to Trafalgar Square, which has been around since basically the dawn of time, though Horatio Nelson, who stands at the top of the plinth there, is more of the Georgian era, so we'll talk about him later. The thing that shocked me most here, besides how busy and full of life it is that there's a statue of Charles I here, staring kind of off into the distance, and it's not until you get behind him and look from a long way away that he is facing off with a statue of Oliver Cromwell that's standing at Parliament. This has been one of my biggest realizations of the trip, and honestly, standing there and thinking of these two foes facing off for all of time kind of gave me chills. I paid tribute to my main man, George Washington, on the way out, and started searching for more kingly drama. The National Portrait Gallery is just a plethora of history. I started getting stoked about this lovely portrait of Sarah Siddons, one of the most successful actors of the Georgian era, and then moved right into the king stuff. First, I took a good solid look at Charles I, the twinkly bastard. This guy clearly spared no expense. He looks fabulous, he looks confident, and I wonder if he knows, standing here, that his downfall would lead to one of the biggest revolutions in British history. In the same room, awkward, is Oliver Cromwell himself, looking slightly better than the dark, brooding statue you see at Parliament or the death mask that I showed you far earlier in the video. But seeing this portrait made me think back to the death mask and made me inclined to compare the two to one another to see how the man changed based on public perception and then how he actually looked at a moment of such intense vulnerability as death. I think it's really incredible to look at these two art pieces side by side. The first is kind of a propaganda portrait, really. It shows Cromwell as heroic, as noble, but not in a kingly sense. He's a man of the people, and he's there to speak for the people in a people's revolution. But he still needs to be trustworthy. He still needs to look heroic, masculine, and brave. And then you look at this death mask, and it's an old man sleeping. Basically, he goes from this young, virile, confident guy with a twinkle in his eye to dead, like we all do. And I found that comparing him in his prime to him in perfect honesty at the end of his life was really moving for me as someone who very suddenly became kind of obsessed with the legacy of Oliver Cromwell. After Cromwell's death, a lot of his visions completely fell apart, and a new king was brought in, the adorable itsy-bitsy King Charles II. Look at how cute he is here with his little puppy. I mean, oh my goodness. The man grew up to look pretty gnarly, but for all intents and purposes was considered an all-right king. He learned well from his father and didn't get too involved in actual political business and was more there as a figurehead, kind of like the kings that we're more familiar with now. My favorite part of seeing his portrait, though, was to see the two women next to him. The first, Catherine of Braganza, his wife. Poor Catherine. He didn't like Catherine very much. And the illustrious, the superb, my personal hero, Nell Gwynn. She was the first big pop star and was a very famous actor, singer, dancer, and prostitute. Back in her day, she was also well known for being a mistress of Charles II and, by all intents and purposes, probably his most popular. She had several children by him and has earned her place right next door to his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. Okay, so the short version is that Nell Gwynn is the greatest, and we saw a play that was about her, and she is the greatest, and I kind of want to be her when I grow up now, because she was confident, she was bold, she put up with zero bullshit, and she looked fabulous. I mean, did you see that portrait? Did you see that I give zero fucks smile? I'm living for this woman, and it's super cool, I think, to find people from history that you can look up to. Oh, by the way, an epilogue. It turns out, right as I was researching this period, I realized that I lived a few blocks up the street from Cromwell Road itself. It's funny how these things work out. Anyway, from going in blind to coming out with a few new people that I'm bizarrely and slightly unhealthily fascinated with, I'm really happy with my work on the Reformation and Restoration eras of British history and how they lead into the Georgian era, which is what you're going to see next week. The Georgian era is pretty exciting because that's when the US finally becomes a thing. You see how much history there was before we existed? That picture of the ceiling in Parliament from earlier in the video, that ceiling is older than the United States. So, until then, thank you all so much for listening. Live your best lives and be good.